And also, different regions that you want to tell apart, they should have significantly different values. That also makes it easier. The more different they are, the easier it will be to tell a computer how to distinguish between the two. And regions should be smooth, have smooth boundaries. That also makes it easier. And they should be spatially accurate. And I think what I mean with that specifically is that you, the more contrast you have between regions, the easier it is to define where is the dividing line between them. If they're really fuzzy, the edges, or slowly varying from one object to another, it's very difficult to find exactly where is the boundary between them. So the more regions adhere to these properties, the easier the segmentation problem is. There's some terminology that I want you to remember. Different levels of region identification and segmentation. So if you have this image here on the top left, the simplest first step that you could try is to train a computer to recognize whether a specific type of object is in an image or not and where it's roughly located. So that's the problem of detection and localization. But what we're going to talk about today is more specifically about segmentation. So there are two different types, roughly, of segmentation. The first is called semantic segmentation, where you try to basically classify each and every pixel, so telling to what class each and every pixel belongs. So that could be, in this case, there are 3 or actually 4 classes. There's the background. It's either background or it's a bottle. It's part of a bottle. Or a pixel is type of a cup, or it's part of a cube. Okay, so then you've done a classification, but then you still haven't fully solved the segmentation problem, because you can have objects, as you see here in the bottom right, where you have multiple instances of the same type of object, and they're overlapping or they're adjacent. And in the semantic segmentation approach, you will not separate these objects properly, but in instance segmentation you do. So these are two different types of segmentation problems, and this is terminology that you will see a lot in literature: semantic segmentation versus instance segmentation. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So there are many different segmentation approaches, and we're going to talk about many of them today that I want you to have a basic understanding of. Different approaches to solve the problem. You could look at segmentation as, I want to find different regions, so I'm looking at the whole of the pixel body of a region. Or you could try to solve the segmentation problem from the contour perspective, trying to find the edges or the boundaries of objects. And if you can do this properly, you've also solved the region problem. Everything that's in the contour, if it's a closed contour, is the object. So it's different ways of looking at images. You can look at them from a region perspective or contour perspective. You could also think about using template matching. I'm not completely sure if you've heard about that, but basically it means that you define a template. So let's say a representative example image of an object that you want to find in an image, in another image, and then you do some kind of correlation, for example, to find out where that object is, or whether it's there or not, and where it is. It's kind of a detection problem, but you can also use it as an initialization for further segmentation. Splitting and merging approaches, well, I'm going to talk about that in more detail, and optimization-based methods. We're all going to tell you in more detail about different types of techniques that fall into these different categories. A few remarks I want to make before we get more technical is also that at this moment, there is still, after, what is it, 50 or 60 years of computer vision research, since as soon as people started to make digital images, they also started to think of ways to how to analyze them. So that's since the 1960s or something now. But still there is no single segmentation method that will be good for every type of image. And that is obviously because images can be very, very, very different. So to be successful in solving the segmentation problem, it's essential that you use every possible knowledge that you have about the objects that you want to segment. Use that to your advantage. So for example, if you know that in a particular application whatever that may be, you know, some security application, you will always be looking at images of faces, human faces, then it's a bit stupid to try to to solve this segmentation problem with a very generic method that ignores all specific knowledge that you may have about what a human face looks like. You can build very nice models, mathematical models or contour models of what a human face looks like, and then try to match that model to your data directly. So that's a form of using prior knowledge. You already know what you want to find in the images. Try to model that somehow and fit it to your data. And that may be much more successful than trying a very generic method, such as thresholding, which we're going to talk about in a second, which you've already heard about. Yeah, so this is a nice example of where you might use domain knowledge. In the other image that I'm showing here, it's much more difficult to think of. Well, I mean, you could try to model human body shapes rather than just the faces and try to fit that to your data. But anyway, it's important to remember that the more you know about what you're looking at in the images, and the better you're able to model this and take that to use that to your advantage, the more successful you can solve the segmentation problem. Actually, I'm saying here that there's no single segmentation method. Maybe nowadays, with all these machine learning and in particular deep learning methods using convolutional neural networks, they may actually go there, because this has been coming up in the last 5, 6 years, 7 years or so in computer vision, and deep neural nets are being used now, applied in more and more and more areas of computer vision, also in biomedical imaging, for example. And the results look very promising. So this seems to be going there, you know, to the ideal scenario of having one generic kind of methodology that you can train to every type of segmentation problem in this case. But, well, we'll have to see how this develops in the coming years. But definitely, neural nets are extremely important, and so we will spend some time talking about that as well. Not in this lecture, but in, I think, 3 weeks from now, there's going to be a separate lecture on deep learning, because that's really, or maybe I've already had a course on the subject, but we also want to specifically talk about deep learning in the context of computer vision, because it's a really promising technology. But in this lecture, we're just going to talk about alternative non-neural network, non-deep learning techniques that have been developed over the many years and that are still very useful for particular applications, and even in combination with deep learning techniques. So even when people use deep learning in medical image analysis, for example, they may still use a range of more traditional techniques, either for post-processing the images to make it easier for the deep learning system to do the segmentation problem, for example, or as a post-processing step to further enhance the results of you know, the output of a deep learning system. So today I'm just going to go through a couple of techniques that are the most prominent ones that you will find in the literature that have been proposed over the many years. In some cases we go a little bit deeper, in other cases I'm just trying to explain the concept. It's good to, if you remember at least the basic ideas of, you know, when you see the term, then you roughly know, oh, that's how it works, roughly, okay? And in some cases, I'm actually going to give the algorithm because it's more easy to explain that way. Yeah, so I talked about domain knowledge. So here I'm showing an image, just to emphasize my point even more, that images can vary widely, incredibly. So here, what you see here are all microscope images, and they're all of cells, you know, and still they're all different, and they have different properties, and you can imagine that it's not so easy to come up with a method that will be able to segment, you know, one single method that will be able to segment all these images with high accuracy, because they're so very different. Okay, so and here's an illustration, and then we're going to go into the outline of this course in more detail. So here's an example of some different techniques that we're going to discuss today: active contours, level sets, and they've all been applied to different images. So they're all very different, and so For example, in this case, an active contour model actually makes a lot of sense. Here you might want to use level sets. This is mean shifting, I believe. Yeah, we're going to talk about these techniques and why they work for these images. But again, it all depends on the application, what kind of technique you might want to use or would work best. Okay, so now we get to the actual techniques that we're going to look at today. I'm first going to do a brief recap of some of the things that you have already heard in this course, but I want to dig a little deeper and make it more specific about image segmentation, thresholding, k-means clustering, and also the feature extraction-based approach. And then I'm going to talk about 8 different ideas, concepts for doing image segmentation or related to image segmentation. All these terms that you see here, they may mean nothing to you now, but at the end of this course, or at least before the exam, 5 minutes before the exam at least, you should know what they mean and you know, roughly how it works and how you would apply these techniques. And in the end, I hope we have time then, but then I also want to briefly talk about how do you evaluate segmentation methods? How do you know when a method is good? What kind of strategies can you use for that? And metrics also to determine this. So that's the outline of this approach, of the approach to this lecture for today. Any questions at this point? If you have any questions in between, just raise your hand and we can talk about it. Okay, then let's first think a little bit more about the techniques that you've heard about, maybe even just in between lines of the previous lectures, but they were there. I've seen them in the lecture notes. The simplest thresholding technique that people have been using since the very beginning, 1960s, 70s, you can find papers where people use this technique, thresholding. So what that basically means is, as you know, an image can have a range of possible intensity values or colors, but let's talk about intensities in this case. And what thresholding does is you define a specific value, the threshold. Every pixel that has an intensity equal to or higher than the threshold, you label it as object pixel, and if it's below, it's background. Okay. This works in images where, if you look at the intensity distribution, the histogram, the histogram must be at least bimodal, meaning it must have 2 modes, 2 peaks, corresponding to the intensity ranges or distributions of the object versus the background. Or if you have different types of objects, they must also be well separated by different modes of the histogram. As long as that is the case, you can use thresholding, but in most cases, that is not so. It's much more complicated. The histogram is much more complicated, but this image on the left almost is already binary. So the histogram is not surprisingly very bimodal, and if you apply the threshold there, you will get a segmentation. So you turn a grayscale image into a binary image, where now every pixel is either object or background. And when you're at that stage, it's very easy to compute separate objects using the connected components algorithm, which I'm going to explain in more detail later on in the lecture, how this works. And then the computer can easily compute all kinds of features, shapes, object areas, surface areas, for example. So if it's bimodal, that's great. If it's not bimodal, you can expect problems. So here's an example where the image is much more noisy, and the intensity distribution of the cells, in this case, and their spots, some particular molecules within the cell nucleus, they're so widely varying and even overlapping with the mode of the histogram corresponding to the background, which is also very noisy. You may not be able to see it so easily in the image, but maybe later on, if you look at the slides and you zoom in, you will see there's a lot of noise in the background as well. So here it's very difficult to choose the right threshold. And there's no way, I mean, you're going to have all kinds of false positives. So that means pixels classified as object, but they should be background. And false negatives, pixels that are classified as background, but that should be object. And you're never going to solve this by shifting the threshold to another position. You know, if you move it down, then more pixels are going to be classified as object. which reduces the number of false negatives but increases the number of false positives, and the other way around as well. Okay, so there's no way around this. You need to do something else. You could use still thresholding, maybe, but then you need to do proper pre-processing of the images or post-processing of the segmentation. And I'm not going to talk about that today. Maybe I'm going to spend some time Friday talking about a particular class of image processing methods called mathematical morphology. That's a whole field of research, or used to be anyway. Now it's pretty much solved, and people use it all the time. That are developed specifically for this purpose. So you can use mathematical morphology either to pre-process images to come up with better quality images to do thresholding, so to simplify the segmentation problem, or you can use them to post-process segmentation results to fill in all kinds of gaps and stuff like that. So I'm not going to talk about that further today, but on Friday I think I'm going to spend some time on that. So that's thresholding. I just wanted to emphasize the weaknesses of thresholding and the conditions under which you can apply it. But so k-means clustering is another technique, very popular. It's been used for ages, which can work, for example, on pretty much the same image, but now I've filtered it a little bit to get rid of some of the noise at least. Because in this image you could say, well, you know, with thresholding, the way I applied it in the previous slides, you make it a binary, it's a binary problem. But if you know that there are more than two types of objects in the images, then you either need to do multi-level thresholding, which I'm going to talk about as well, or you can use these clustering techniques, k-means clustering, for example. And this has been mentioned before, so k-means is simply, k is the number of objects that you expect, and so you define k random intensities as the cluster centers in the histogram. You assign every pixel to one of the clusters based on the closest intensity difference, or the cluster to which it is closest in terms of intensity. Then you recompute the means, you recluster the pixels, recompute the means, etc., until it converges, and then you end up with a clustering like this, for example, which looks reasonably okay, but there's still a lot of noise in the segmentation that would require further processing. So it has obvious disadvantages, and the biggest problem is, of course, what is k? How do you know what is k? In some cases you may know it, in some applications, but in this case, if you have an image like this, what is k supposed to be? I have no idea. You need to think about that. So it doesn't always work in all applications. And then the third one is feature-based classification. Yeah, so that means that for every pixel, so it says here, segmentation by sliding window patch-based feature extraction. So basically what that means is you just define a window size, could be circular or square, doesn't really matter. It needs to have a certain shape, ideally symmetrical, and then you don't discriminate any directions in the image. And then you just pixel by pixel, you shift, so pixel by pixel, you look at the pixel properties within the window around that center pixel that you're considering, and then you compute all kinds of features, and you can use them for classification, because every feature that you compute then becomes a dimension in the feature space. So you turn pixels into a position in feature space where you can do clustering then, or you can train a classifier such as support vector machines. We're going to talk about that in the deep learning course a bit more. But this is very computationally expensive also. You need to compute many features to make sense of what is going on in each and every pixel. So this is a sliding window-based approach. Requires also many examples, because to train a classifier you need to provide it with a lot of input-output examples. And that is also very labor-intensive to construct such a thing. But it can be done. So these are some basic techniques I wanted to briefly recap. And already I pointed out that each and every one of them has advantages and disadvantages. It's going to be the same for these more sophisticated techniques, but they may be more suitable for particular segmentation problems. Okay, so the first concept I want to briefly talk about is region splitting and merging. And the idea is, and this is used in not only this, these first few slides, but also it's going to come back in a few other slides as well. This concept of, if you have an image, one way to do the segmentation would be to first try to split up the whole image, partition the image into little regions that have more or less uniform or homogeneous characteristics according to intensity, color, or texture, or whatever. And then, so that's a total over-segmentation of the image, and then you try, in a second step, you try to merge these little patches, these little regions, into hopefully meaningful objects based on all kinds of shape criteria or, you know, boundary properties. So it's first splitting and then merging those little pieces together again in meaningful objects. And again, in a way, thresholding is the simplest approach to this problem, because what you do with thresholding is you divide the whole image, or for every pixel you say whether it's object or background, or which object it is, for example. And then if you want to, in the end, if you've done this thresholding, that's just, you know, making this distinction between object and background. But then, before you can do any meaningful calculations on these object pixels, you first need to determine which pixels actually belong together. Because now it's just, if an image is like this after thresholding, all it says is that a pixel is either an object pixel or a background pixel, but it doesn't say which pixels belong together and form an object that you can actually analyze. So here is a question to you. How many objects are there, would you say, in this segmented, or let's say this thresholded image? Does anybody dare to guess or want to say something? 3. Yeah, I would say the same, but why actually? Can you tell me why?
Because there are 2 separate lines. There are 2 separating lines.
Yeah.
Between,
Mm-hmm.
Objects.
There seem to be separating lines such that it appears like there are 3 objects. Okay, but let's. This is very good. I would say the same thing. But now let's think about it from the computational perspective. How do you implement that? How do you tell the computer that there are 3 objects? The way typical algorithms determine to which object any of those pixels belong will show you that you actually get a very different answer. I will show you in the following slides. The first fundamental thing that you have to define here is the connectivity of pixels that you consider. And if images are 2-dimensional, then the most frequently used, let's say, symmetrical connectivities that people use are 4 connected and 8 connected. So 4 connected means if you look at a center pixel, then the top, bottom, left, and right pixels you consider connected to that pixel, and the diagonal ones you consider not connected. Whereas in 8 connected, all 8 neighboring pixels of the center pixel are connected. Okay, so these are the 2 basic connectivities. You could also think of other types of connectivities, asymmetrical ones, but this is mostly used. In 3D, if you do 3-dimensional image processing, this translates to 6 connected or 26 connected, and sometimes people also use 18 connected. But so you don't consider the corners of the cube. But now let's see what happens with this connectivity. So we had this thresholded image, and trust me, it's exactly the same one I showed before. And now, if you take 4 connectivity as the criterion to determine whether pixels belong together or not, then you end up with 10 objects. Because you have a lot of pixels that are diagonally connected, but not, you know, with top, bottom, left, right. So they're separate objects. They're considered to be separate objects. Whereas if you use 8 connectivity, then the number of objects is 1 because they're all connected. Okay, so it's not so. If you start zooming in and look at it from the pixel level, how to connect things, then the way that's normally done in this. Okay, I admit it. It's a bit of a fabricated example, of course, to illustrate the point. But this may happen easily in segmentation, and you do a connected components algorithm, but then you end up with objects like this that are not exactly what you expected them to be. So this is something to keep in mind. So how does this work, this labeling that I'm showing here, this colored labeling? This is called the connected components algorithm. So I want to briefly go through the steps because it's a very clever algorithm that's been used and published already a long time ago. But so depending on the connectivity that you use, you are going to use a mask that looks like this or looks like this. So the center pixel is corresponds to the pixel that we're going to look at in the thresholded image. And this just tells you which pixels to consider in the process. So only in the 4 connected case, the top and left one, and in the 8 connected case, those 4 other ones that are white here. So then the way it works is you just pass through the image from top left to bottom right. For every pixel, top left to bottom right, you check if it's an object pixel or not. If it is an object pixel, then you look at its neighbors, and either you do this in a 4 connected or 8 connected way. You have to make the choice there in advance. But then if none of the neighbors, the 4 or 8 connected neighbors of that pixel have a label, then you assign a new label. So if you run through these pixels here, then here you will hit the first one. So it doesn't have pixels that are already labeled as neighboring pixels, so it gets a new label. And if pixels do have neighbors with labels, then you assign the smallest label. So the next one, for example, by the time I get to this pixel, I already have a neighboring pixel that's been labeled, so it gets the same label, it gets 1. Okay, so when I get here, that's a new pixel. Neighbors have not been labeled, so it's 2. So you see the answer here of the first pass. This is the output of the first pass. So you go all the way like this, but also in the process you record any equivalences. So by the time you get to this pixel, for example, below the green one, then the pixel on top of it has already been labeled, and the one left of it has also been labeled. So now we come to a new pixel, we need to label it. Or actually I should go here. It's this pixel, but this one and this one have already been labeled in this, as shown over here. And then you take the smallest, so it becomes 1, but you also record that now we have pixels that are connected, but they have different labels. So obviously they should have the same labels, so you keep track of that. So you build equivalent sets. So in the end, if you pass through the whole image, you will get a set that says that 1 and 2 and 6 are supposed to be the same, and 3 and 4 and 5 as well. So and that's what you're going to resolve in the second pass. You're again going through the result of the first pass, and you just replace labels with the smallest one from the equivalent set. So you just go through all of them, and this says it's 2, oh, that should be 1, etc. So you correct for this in the second pass, and then you end up with an image like this. So this is how I did this. So these nice colored components or objects are computed like this, connected components algorithm. Okay, we were talking about region splitting. It's a very old concept already, and based on very similar to, you could say, you could use a thresholding kind of approach to do this. Look at the histogram, define a threshold, or compute it automatically. There are many methods to compute thresholds automatically that will find the threshold in the valleys, for example. That gives you a separation of the histogram into 2 objects or 2 classes, object or background, for every pixel. But you can repeat this. So once you've done a first pass, using, for example, thresholding and some kind of method that automatically computes the threshold, it will first separate the two biggest peaks in the histogram, and then you consider all the pixels that belong to one side of the histogram and recompute a threshold there, and then you can iterate this until you're satisfied. You can come up with as many thresholds as you want and separate the whole histogram of pixels into multiple sets of pixels corresponding to multiple objects. So actually what we're doing here, it's what you could also call, it's a measurement space clustering process. You're translating an image into a cluster or into a measurement space, a feature space, where you're going to do clustering. That is the whole idea, and this is one of the simplest way to do it is just to look at intensities in the histogram. The histogram in this case is the measurement space of the image. And you can do the clustering there and then map back the result to the image and apply connected components algorithm to find the object. So here's an example with where the separation of the histogram of the distribution of intensities has been done twice in the histogram to get to 3 types of objects. Although the coloring here is just based on the threshold and not, I have not run a connected components algorithm here yet. So you would actually find more objects here. Okay, this is just a repetition of the same. It's a diagram. I'm not going to repeat it, but it just graphically illustrates how the algorithm works. Repeated or iterative separation of the feature space into different areas. So splitting, and then the big challenge comes: how do we merge all these objects? And this can be done in a ton of different ways, so I'm not sure we're going to be very specific about that today, but just generally what people have been using to do this is all kinds of heuristics about the boundary lengths. So for example, when you merge little fragments of objects together, then the resultant boundary length should not deviate too much from, you know, the average or from the shape that you're ultimately interested in. So you need to put a lot of prior knowledge into this process to be able to do this. You can look at edge strengths, boundary lengths, distances between points within regions, whether you're not you merge them, or look at intensity, color, or size differences. So it's a very heuristic approach that people have been using. You can also look at it. This is one particular algorithm to do it, to do region merging, where you represent each little fragment by its minimum spanning tree, because you need to come up with some kind of connectivity of the pixels, and also between regions, adjacent regions. You define a dissimilarity measure that could be as simple as just intensity difference, and then you can compute different types of similarities, both internal in a region. So you have, for every region, you have all the pixels, you know how they're connected, for example, using a minimum spanning tree. And then you compute the internal region difference as the maximum over all the edges in the minimum spanning tree of this dissimilarity, or intensity difference. But you can also compute dissimilarity between regions. So all the vertices in a graph representation of the image, where one pixel is within one object and another pixel is in another object, so the edge crosses regions. So you can look at all the edges where that are connecting one region to another, compute the same dissimilarity measure there, and look at the minimum, and then, for example, come up with a rule like this: merge if any two adjacent regions have a dissimilarity that is smaller than the minimum of the internal differences of the two regions. Because you have two regions, they have internal differences, both of them. You take the minimum of that, and then you merge if the the external or the cross-region dissimilarity is smaller than the minimum of the two, for example. This is one heuristic that people have been using for some region merging applications. Here are some examples taken from this paper that I can recommend you to have a look at. Efficient graph-based image segmentation, where these ideas have been used. Works to some extent, but I wouldn't say this is anywhere near what you would want it to be. I mean, it tells you something, but it's very far from a complete object segmentation that would be useful, I think, for further analysis. I mean, if you look at this figure, I mean, there's a lot of... you've done segmentation to some extent, but it's still, and emerging to some extent, but it's still not complete or something. This looks a bit better, though. Region merging, it can also be as simple as, this is even a simpler, more simplified version of it, where, and it's called region growing, as stated here, where you start from a seed pixel. This is usually used in interactive segmentation software tools, where you can click a point, and then from there on, you look at the neighboring pixels of that point. You look at intensity differences, and you know, if the intensities are sufficiently similar within some error margin, you merge them, and you look at the neighboring pixels of those merged pixels, and so on. So you grow from a seed point a whole region that is more or less similar to the pixel or a small neighborhood around that pixel in terms of intensity or average intensity or texture or whatever. So this is called region growing, and it can be used, for example, in medical imaging applications like this, where you have, this is a brain scan, MRI brain scan, or at least one slice out of a brain scan. And the gray matter is nicely segmented here from the two seed pixels that are clicked by the physician, by the radiologist, and then it grows into, you know, it connects all the pixels that are more or less similar to it, and you get a nice segmentation that you can then use for further analysis. What is the size of the white matter versus the gray matter of the brain, etc. So that's called region growing as a special form of region merging, you know, all the way from the pixel level up. Another technique, just stop me anytime if you have any questions, right? Otherwise, I just continue for, let's continue for, I will explain this method and then we take a little break, okay? So watershed segmentation. Watershed segmentation, is anybody familiar with this technique already? Have you heard about it or not? You've heard about it?
Heard about it.
Okay. The best way for me to explain it is by way of an analogy. The analogy of immersing a topographic surface into water. So what do I mean by that? So suppose my image looks like this. This is an actual image, a true image from a microscope image of membrane-labeled cells. So you're looking at cells, but their membranes have been labeled within a tissue, and then it looks like this in a microscope image. So where are the cells? Well, visually it's pretty clear. It's just the valleys of, you know, if you look at the image as a landscape, you know, if the third dimension is the intensity, then you can imagine it's a landscape. Actually, let me show you that. So if you take one scan line and you would just plot the intensity, then it roughly looks like this. Okay, so this is the function, and I've already drilled these holes here. So from the minima of the function, you look at it as a landscape, literally, and you drill holes from the minima all the way down, and then you dip this surface into water. So what will happen? Okay, here's the water. I'm going to put it in. So what will happen, of course, is that the water gets in through these pipes, and it will rise in all the basins. And you're going to monitor whether two basins are going to merge or not. You know, at some point, this one is about to merge, these two basins, and you're going to prevent that from happening. You build a dam, and then you continue dipping the thing, and whenever regions are about to merge, you put a you build a dam to avoid that from happening. And then in the end, you have what is called the watershed lines. And this is a very nice analogy because this is literally pretty much how you implement it in the computer as well. So this is Meyer's flooding algorithm for watershed segmentation. You choose a set of markers, and that could be, for example, the minima, as I explained, but it doesn't have to be. You can also manually choose seed points, let's say, or markers. You give each a different label, and then you put the neighboring pixels of these markers in a priority queue with priority level corresponding to the gray value. Meaning that, and that's from bottom up, so the low values have the highest priority. The higher the value, the lower the priority. And then you pop the pixel from, with the highest priority from the queue. And if the neighbors have already been labeled, you give it the same label. If they all have the same label, so if you consider the next pixel, if its neighbors have already been labeled and have the same label, then that pixel also gets the same label. But if it's not, if it has neighboring pixels that have been labeled, but they have different labels, then you're not going to label that pixel. So you're going to keep it out. And all non-labeled neighbors of that pixel that have never been into the queue, you put them into the queue. So this way you fill the queue all the time with neighboring pixels of pixels that you have already considered and process them this way. And you repeat that all the time until the queue is empty, and then you're left with a bunch of pixels that have not been labeled, and those are exactly the watershed lines. So it implements in algorithmic language, so to speak, precisely this approach to segmentation. Here's an example result. So here you have an image where the objects are indeed, the minima correspond to the minima in the image, the lowest intensities. And if I would directly apply watershed segmentation to this image, which is what I've done here, then you will get an image like this, a labeled image like this, where you see that it's far from perfect. It's not what it should be, right? And the reason why this happens is that this image, okay, so when you look at it from a distance, it looks pretty smooth and nice. But if you would literally look at the pixel level, what are the values? It turns out there are many more local minima within those dark regions. So they all become one of the basins in the watershed segmentation. And that's exactly what you see here. It's very fragmented. So what you need to do to prevent this from happening is pre-process the image, filter it, smooth it, so that you get rid of these false local minima, and then apply watershed segmentation. So that's what you need to do if an image is noisy and has many local minima, but there may be other problems as well. For example, an image may not be in the form that you can apply watershed segmentation. So in this case, this is a simple example, where the objects that I'm interested in are not the local minima, but the maxima. Okay, so then you first need to translate or transform the image into a form where the objects are the local minima. So you can either invert that image, or you can compute an edge image. You've heard about edge detection. Well, this is the gradient magnitude image, for example, and then you can do watershed segmentation. Yeah, this is the last slide and then before the break, and then so a few very important notes that you have to remember from watershed segmentation. The first one I already mentioned. It can have a lot of local minima, so you get an over-segmentation, meaning you have too many objects, more than you want, more than are meaningful. So you can pre-process it, or you can also do some kind of, so here again comes the problem of region merging. You can use watershed segmentation to do the splitting, for example, so as a form of region splitting, but then you're left with the merging problem. You can apply those merging techniques, or you can use other kinds of Bayesian merging, post-processing techniques to do the Bayesian merging. Many different implementations of the algorithm exist. I just showed you one in simple language, but there are many different specific implementations. And the last remark I also already made before, I would want to repeat that, is that you don't have to do a full segmentation from all the local minima. You can also, using another algorithm, for example, detect meaningful points from where you do the watershed segmentation to get to the number of objects that you want. So you can also you can combine it with other pre-processing techniques to find the right markers for your problem. Okay, so let's take a little break now. If you have any questions, if you want to get some water or something, or if you have any questions in the meantime, you can come to me and we can discuss a little bit more. And then we continue at, let's say at 4 o'clock, we continue with the second part of this lecture.
Yeah. So, about particularly about this part, first that what if all the neighbors are not labeled, which will happen to popped pixel.
They must have, because you start with the seed points. You start with seed points, and the ones that end up on the priority queue are the neighbors of those points.
If some of them are not labeled, it says if the neighbors of the popped pixels all have
The same label.
All have the same label, but like the first marker is a pixel, right? And we put the neighbor pixels
on the queue?
4 pixels or eight
Yes.
into a queue, and we pop the highest priority out, and there is only one pixel labeled.
Yes.
So,
It says all have the same label.
yeah, what that means is, it means that if the neighbors of the popped pixel that have already been labeled all have the same label. So when they're on the priority queue, they have not been labeled yet. So you take the pixel off the queue, that's the one you're going to consider next. You look at the neighbors of that pixel that have already been labeled.
Oh, okay. So pick from this subset of the neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. You look only at the ones that have already been labeled, and if they all have the same label, then that pixel also gets that label.
Okay.
That's the nice thing.
And this algorithm is it only suitable for like a
Binary.
Yeah.
Yeah, binary images. Yeah, it's totally meant to label binary images. So
I know, because they're free values, it will get confused.
sorry,
If there are free values, I think this can be confused because it won't know which is the background and which
yeah,
is
exactly.
the
Yeah. So you first need to do some kind of, for example, thresholding or whatever. You need to translate an image into a binary image, which is object or background, and then this algorithm it tells different objects apart. It labels them as separate objects.
That's right. Okay.
It's like the next step to come up with the labeled image. So I would say this together you could consider the segmentation problem. So the first is how to determine whether a pixel is an object or a background, and then you do this algorithm to detect whether there are different objects among the object pixels.
Yeah, among
Yeah, exactly.
Yes?
Thank you.
All right, yes, it's time to continue. Welcome back. We're going to talk about a few more techniques for segmentation. And the next one I want to talk about is an idea called maximally stable extremal regions, MSAR, that people have been using, in particular in applications where the images are not too complicated, so they satisfy this criterion that I mentioned in one of the early slides this afternoon, that objects should be more or less uniform in intensity or whatever characteristic that you want to use, and surrounded by objects or background that has a very different intensity. Because what you can do then is you could use thresholding, but then you consider the results of thresholding for a whole range of different threshold values. And you look at what objects does every threshold produce, and how long will objects remain stable? Meaning that if you change the threshold, will an object change shape drastically or stay pretty much the same over a whole range of thresholds? That's the idea of this algorithm. So you consider regions to be objects only if they are stable over a whole range of thresholds. So there's a little movie here. I'm not sure if it's going to work to play this thing, but otherwise you can look it up yourself. These links are clickable in the PDF that you can download. And then there's a YouTube movie that shows you actually this process. If you change the whole range of thresholds, if you change the thresholds over a whole range, then it shows you what that means in this image. What kind of objects do you get? And the ones that remain for a whole range of thresholds, that's what you consider to be the object. So here are some examples from this paper. That's another paper that uses this specific technique to analyze images taken from an airplane, to study a landscape, for example. I've done some processing here. So these are the original images, but they're very, very noisy. If you would apply any segmentation technique directly on these images, you will get very noisy results. So this comes back to what I mentioned earlier. Usually it helps to do some kind of pre-processing. In this case, They have used, I think, a closing operation. That's an example of an image processing technique from mathematical morphology, which I mentioned earlier, so I'm going to talk about that on Friday, what that means. But this helps to get rid of some of the noise, and then if you apply these maximally stable extremal regions, you get pretty nice results. Nicely labeled image with all the different objects. So that's one other concept that you could use, that people have used. Here's another one, mean shifting. So here's a totally different image. Some picture from a street in probably Italy or something, I don't know. How would you segment this image based only on color? So here's an example where you could apply the same idea as what I explained before. Look at the histogram of an image. Now this is a color image, of course, so you have to think a little bit more about this. But what you could do is you could translate this image into a point cloud, as shown on the right here, where the 3 dimensions are actually the 3 color components of the color space used in this image. So this is LUV in this case, or it could also be RGB, but usually LUV works better for this kind of problem. But so what's been done here is every pixel has a certain LUV value. Every pixel has this vector of 3 components. And so it means it's a point in this color space. Every pixel becomes a point in the color space, right? So you get a point cloud. And then you could do some kind of clustering. That's one way you could do it. For example, k-means clustering. If you would know how many objects there are, if you would know k, you could apply k-means clustering to this feature space representation of the image. In this case, only color. But you could think of other features as well. In the pixel, you could also include not just these LUV components, but also edge strength, or whether what some quantitative measure of texture or whatever. Every time you add a feature, it adds a dimensionality to your feature space. But it all comes down to the same thing: is that every pixel becomes a point in that space. And you can take into account any kinds of features that you want in this case. But then the challenge is how to cluster this feature space. So, and k-means clustering would be one way to do it if you would know k. In this case, I would say it's not very meaningful. I have no idea what k should be here, and so it's a bit tricky. You need to play with k then, and k-means clustering is also sensitive to outliers and prone to local minima. So mean shifting is a very nice alternative idea that you can use for the clustering problem here. Because what mean shifting does is seeking stationary points, peaks, modes in a density function, because that's what this is. This point cloud is what you call a density function, meaning in every point in the space, you can define a measure of density. How many points are there around this point? So you can already visually see that there are areas that have very low density. There are very few pixels there, or points there corresponding to pixels. And there are areas with very high density. And this mean shifting works on density functions. And it attempts to find all the possible clusters in that feature space. And the nice thing is that it doesn't require you to set any number k, for example, as in k-means clustering. How many objects do you want? It will find out itself. I will show you in a minute how that works. And it's a variant of what is called the iterative steepest ascent method. You climb, in a way, you climb to the area in the feature space where you have the highest density. So the way it works is like this. Initialize a random seed point, x, and you need to define a window, n. That can be anything. Let's say it's most sensible to use a sphere or something if you have a 3-dimensional space. And then what you do is you calculate the mean, or center of gravity, mx within n. So you define a seed point, you have a region around it, you compute the mean of all the points mean position, mean intensity, mean color, whatever mean. So you need to define the measure. And then, so you have this mean, and you shift the window to that mean that you calculated. So then you're in a new position, and you again calculate the mean, and then you shift to the new mean, etc. So this is an iterative process until convergence, meaning that, you know, whenever you compute the next mean, it's not so far away from the original anymore. You use some error margin. At some point you've converged, you're stuck into a point which is apparently the highest density, or the highest whatever, according to the measure that you use. So here we use mean, for example, like this. This is purely based on spatial coordinates, so it computes literally the density, or a representation of the density, and you use, in this case, a Gaussian kind of weighting, so that points that are closer to the center of the window have a higher weight than points that are further away. So you can introduce this kind of weighting as well. But then here, this visually, what I just explained, you start with a seed point, you look within a window to the, you incorporate all the points that are within this window and to compute a new mean, and then you shift to that point, and so on until you're converged. And this is just an example how it works for one seed point. Okay, so one seed point, you track it all the way, it converges at some point, and then you're done. But you can do the same thing with a whole set of seed points. And you see in this animation, for every iteration, what happens. So if you start with 100 seed points and you do this mean shifting for all of them, they will all shift towards the region, the area, the position within the space that has the highest density, you know, closest to where you started originally. So when you've converged, then you have many original seed points or windows ending up in the same space. So if they're very close together, you say, okay, all of them actually belong to the same object. So you see that there's overlap. You remove the overlaps. And then the final clustering is done based on let's wait a second until it starts over again. And I can explain what I mean. Okay, so for example, for this seed point, you see it's going to move towards this point all the way in the end. But you recompute the mean based on its surrounding points in the cloud space. So all the points that it visits along the way, they're going to get the label where that seed point ends up in the end. So seed points that were here, they are going to move all the way to here, and then you're going to define that as a cluster, but all the points that were visited along the way are going to get that very same label in the end. So that's what allows you, for example, in this space. So this is the image that I showed before, and this is just a two-dimensional projection of that three-dimensional color space that I showed before. It allows you to, so the highest density, for example, of the yellow pixels, is probably somewhere here, and so all the pixels that are yellowish here, they're going to be part of that same cluster, because apparently the seed points that were here initially, they all ended up here in the highest density of that part of the cloud. And this is a way you can do segmentation in the end. You can perform segmentation by mean shifting, by defining a feature. In this case, it was just color. And you transform all the pixels into that feature space. You initialize windows at many seed points. You let all these seed points shift and converge to something, some final location in the feature space, and merge the ones that end up near the same location, and then cluster all the points according to the window traversal. Does that make sense? Or, yeah? So this is how you can do segmentation with mean shifting. And actually this image that I showed all the way in the beginning, you can make a segmentation using mean shifting like this. And then still, of course, we have this problem of occlusion that I mentioned in the beginning, but it's actually quite a nice segmentation for this image. And here are some other examples as well. So in the end, this is just based on color, as far as I know. This is taken from a paper. I think I have the link on the next slide. But yeah, well, the regions that have more or less the same color with some variation, they will end up in the same object. And you can do some nice artwork with it as well, because with mean shifting, you end up with some kind of mean position in the end, but it also means it corresponds to, the mean corresponds to a specific color. So all the pixels that belong to that cluster, you can give it that very color, and then you get this kind of representation of the same image. It is a segmentation. Every pixel has been labeled here according to the cluster mean. Okay, so as with every method, also this method, it has advantages. It's pretty much free of models, except that, of course, you need to define a window. And that is actually the problem. The window size, or even the window shape, you could argue, are degrees of freedom here that you need to deal with when you implement or use this algorithm. But it finds a variable number of nodes, unlike k-means clustering, and it's very robust to outliers. And so that's a very powerful technique. But it has also limitations. It's very expensive. If you need to do many seed points, you need to start with many seed points. For each and every one of them, you need to do this whole tracking problem, basically. Solve the problem of the tracking to the right mean, and that's very computationally expensive. Output depends on the window size parameter. Selection is not trivial, as I mentioned, but also it doesn't scale very well, of course, with dimensionality of the feature space. I mentioned this a few times. We just looked at color here, but you can make a feature space with all kinds of other features as well. But try to do this in a 10-dimensional space or something. If you don't just look at color, but also some texture features and ridges, ridge strength, edge strength, whatever, then it becomes very expensive. But it's a very nice method. We've been using it a lot as well for various applications that maybe I'm going to talk about in some of the later lectures. Another technique, superpixel segmentation. Actually, this is very much linked to the splitting and merging that I talked about earlier. So here again, the idea is that you first subdivide an image into very small regions that have more or less uniform, homogeneous, that are more or less uniform or homogeneous in certain properties, certain characteristics. And then you subsequently have the region merging problem, of course. But superpixels, I'm going to show you one particular algorithm that does superpixel segmentation, or let's say over-segmentation of the image. It can be a very useful pre-processing step for further segmentation or region merging that you can then do based on the superpixels. That's what they are called. They look like pixels, but they're actually little regions, which are more or less homogeneous. And that's much faster than literally doing a pixel-based segmentation approach, using a sliding window approach. So there are many variants of superpixel algorithms, but the most popular one, or maybe that's because it was one of the first, is the SLIC, simple linear iterative clustering, which is very nice because it preserves boundaries, is fast, and also memory efficient. And here you see some results of superpixel construction, I would say, using different average sizes of the superpixels. So this is a parameter that you can set. I want my superpixels to be of this size, and then the algorithm will give you a partitioning according to that parameter. So here are different values, the results for different values of the average superpixel size. What that value should be is, of course, totally dependent on the problem. on the application. But here's how it works. So you're going to initialize cluster centers on the pixel grid. So you have the pixel grid. You take a step size S. You just take pixels every other S pixels. And then, so that's a let's say initialization step. And then the next initialization step is that you move these points, these cluster centers, to a position with the smallest gradient. So that means that it is more or less homogeneous in that area. The image is more or less homogeneous around the center clusters then. So these are the first two steps are initialization steps. And then we are going to iterate the following steps, which is compute the distance, dik, for every pixel I in a 2s by 2s window around ck. And remember that the clusters were spaced s pixels apart. So that means that if you take a 2s by 2s window around a cluster center, you will end up with overlapping windows. And so it means that for every pixel you may need to compute distances to multiple cluster centers. And you assign the pixel to the cluster with the smallest distance. So that's point number 4. And then after this step, you have completely partitioned the image. All the pixels have been assigned to a cluster. And then you recompute the cluster center, or the mean, let's say, mean color, mean position, whatever you want, based on the pixels that are now assigned to each cluster. And then you iterate. You recompute the distances, you end up with a new partitioning, recompute the means, etc., until it converges, meaning that from one iteration to the next, the positions don't change that much anymore. Now, what is distance? That's the question, of course. You can take anything you want, but in this particular implementation, it is distance in color in the Scilab space, LAB. So the distance between, let's say, the Euclidean distance in the color space between the cluster center and the pixel, and also the spatial distance between the cluster center and the pixel position. And then you combine these two. So, of course, these can have totally different ranges of values. So you need to introduce a parameter here that does a kind of normalization, or that controls the influence of color mean over spatial distance. But this is the algorithm that produced these images, okay? It makes a lot of sense. So once you've done this, you can then do some kind of region merging, as we've discussed before. But that becomes much faster now because you have way fewer objects or partitioned little regions to deal with compared to the full pixel grid. So this is why it's called super pixels. They still look like a bit like pixels, but they're much fewer and much more consistent regions. Yeah, so either whether you look at it from the pixel level or the super pixel level, one way to end up with a segmentation then, so to ultimately do the merging, is what is called a conditional random field approach. Oh, this I already explained, I think. So very generally stated, this is used in many fields, but so it is based on a graphical model representation of the problem. I'm going to show you in a second. You encode relationships between observations. In this case, these are the superpixels, and then construct a consistent interpretation, segmentation of the data. So what do I mean by that? So you're going to construct either, you can also do this at the pixel level once again, but it makes more sense to do it at the superpixel level. You can construct an undirected graph. So every node in the graph is one of the superpixels, and the edges in the graph are the adjacencies. So that's shown on the right here. So this superpixelated image can then be represented as a graph with nodes and edges, And the values of the nodes are based on features of the superpixels, and the values of the edges are based on the similarity between them, of neighboring superpixels. And then what you need to do is you need to define an energy functional like this, for example, which consists of two terms. The first is based on a so-called unary potential, the second on pairwise potential. So the first one is really the data term. It's based on the graph node values. So what that says is you need to compute the cost for a superpixel S to belong to a certain class. Lower cost means higher likelihood that a pixel belongs to a specific class. And how can you compute this likelihood? Well, for example, by applying some kind of classification technique. Could be anything, support vector machines or whatever. We're going to talk more, I think, about classification techniques in the deep learning course, but deep learning lecture. But you can train a classifier based on a lot of examples, input-output relationships, and once that's done, you can feed it with the superpixels, and it will tell you, based on what you've trained that thing, what the most likely class is that the superpixel belongs to. But it will also tell you what is the likelihood. Actually, what a classifier does is it will tell you for any input the likelihood or the probability for any of the classes that you consider in the classification problem. So you can use them here as a cost as a cost value for the nodes in this graph, so for the superpixels. And then you have the pairwise potential that gives you, so that is based on the edges in the graph. It computes a cost for the neighborhood consistency, so how similar are superpixels that are neighboring each other. Higher cost means a higher similarity results in a higher cost. I think it should actually be lower, no? I think this is a mistake, but 0 is if it belongs to the same class. So if you have defined this energy functional on the graph, defined, or you can compute it for the graph, then the region merging problem actually becomes an energy minimization problem. It's an optimization problem now. You've defined a functional and you just need to find the minimum. And this can be done using an optimization technique that's called graph cuts, graph cutting. So we have defined the problem as on a graph representation of the data, and now we need to cut that graph, which is done with an algorithm. People call it graph cutting, but actually it's also known as max flow or min cut. Let me try to explain that. So if this would be my image, and these are now simple pixels, but they could also be the superpixels, whatever, you make a graph representation of that image. You define a source node, which corresponds to the background, and a sink node, which corresponds to the foreground. And what graph cutting does is it defines a dividing line that literally cuts the edges from the graph such that the total energy of the edges that are cut is minimized. So it finds the combination of edges that will cut the graph in two pieces, so separate the source and the sink, in a way that minimizes this energy functional. So this is why it's also called the min-cut algorithm, because it's an energy minimization problem. And if you have found the min-cut, that is equivalent to finding the max flow, because the minimum cut defines the maximum amount of flow that you can push through the network, if you would consider it as a network of water pipes or something. The maximum amount of water that you can pump through this network from the source to the sink, from the top to the bottom, is determined by this min cut. It's, let's say, the weakest link or something in the whole system. So that's roughly the idea how it works. If you want to read up on it in a bit more detail about this algorithm, then click these two links here. They're all about this graph cutting kinds of techniques, max flow, min cut. people use it a lot in image processing to do this final to do the final segmentation, to cut the graph representation of the image or the collection of superpixels. This is an example, by the way, with one source, one sink. So that means you're really going to end up with a binary image, object or background, but you can also do it with multiple sources and sinks to get a multi-object segmentation. And that's what's done in this paper. You may want to have a look at. So this is an image taken from that paper where they use multiple source sync terminals to first do a superpixel construction or representation of that image, and then applying the graph cut to get different objects, multiple objects. Works quite nicely. Okay, the last two techniques that I want to talk about, and then hopefully there's some time left to also talk about evaluation of segmentation methods, is first active contours and then level sets. So active contour segmentation, it really focuses what I mentioned in the beginning as one of the options of one of the ways of looking at this problem. It focuses on the contours of objects rather than the regions. So you may be interested, for example, in this image to find what is the contour or what is the length of this object, for example. So one way to do that would be to, and by the way, these techniques are very often interactive techniques. So they're really developed for interactive segmentation, where you can click a number of points, and then some kind of curve will be interpolated through these points. So you deal with a limited number of control points that determine, in the end, the positioning of the contour, but the rest is interpolated. So it's a sparsified version of the problem. Yeah, so it's a curve fitting problem, basically. You represent the curve by a set of control points, the rest is interpolated, and you iteratively move the control points towards the contour that you're interested in the image. And this can be done, for example, by looking at local edge strength. If you compute the edges of an image, you do filtering, or ridges, or whatever. You can use different types of filters that you then use to steer the control points. So it's an iterative process. You stepwise grow or move towards the strongest gradients, for example, in the image. But it also allows you to set all kinds of shape constraints, because all these points together, they form a shape, right? It can also be a closed contour, by the way. So for example, I think I'm actually going to show that later. Let me go a few slides ahead. Yeah, I'm going to show you this in the next slide. But yeah, it's typically based on following the high gradient areas, which are representations of the object boundaries usually that you're interested in. But it has the power to bridge areas where the gradient is not so strong. That's the nice thing about it. It forces or constrains the solution of finding the contour, also in areas where you have very little image information. So that's illustrated here. This is an image from an electron microscope, which has an extremely high magnification factor. Every pixel is like a nanometer or something. So you really look at very small details, parts of molecules. But suppose you are interested in this object. I have no idea what it is. I don't really know the source of this image, but just for the sake of illustration, if you want to find the contour of this object, then let's think about it for a second. If you zoom in all the way on the contour, parts contain strong gradients, sort of, but there are other parts that are totally not clear, very ambiguous. Where exactly is this boundary? But here comes the power of these active contour methods, is that you can enforce a particular shape of the contour, or a range of, within a certain range of, allowed range of possibilities. Because in this case, I would already know that the object is more or less circular. Okay, so what I can do then, I can define a mathematical model of the shape that I'm interested in. So you define a contour model, which can be a circle or an ellipse or some kind of spline, some interpolated, smooth polynomial curve. And in the end, this is some kind of energy minimization problem. You define an energy functional that is computed along the contour. So that's what I'm trying to say here with this, this formula. You come up with an energy along the contour. You integrate over the contour different types of terms, very similar to this graph cutting problem that I showed before, where you also used an energy functional. And here it's, for example, based on what is the total intensity of, or the gradient strength along the contour. But also, this is a measure of a term that determines the shape in the end. What is the total bending energy, for example? You try to minimize that in the end. So you don't allow very sharp corners, you know, going from one control point to the next. It shouldn't be very abruptly changing the shape locally, but it should stay more or less elliptical or circular. You can enforce that by introducing an energy term that is, for example, integrating the bending energy or something along the contour. And you could also introduce all kinds of user interaction. You can also model as energies. The user may be, for example, because this is going to be an iterative energy minimization, so the contour is going to grow or move towards the object. But in the process, you could also let the user give input, you know, move more towards this or towards this part of the image. All of that you can incorporate into one energy functional that needs then to be minimized. So it's an energy minimization problem. But in the end, what it does, so again, this is usually done in interactive segmentation problems that are very hard to do completely automatically. And then you have tools that allow you, using these techniques, to roughly indicate where is the object that I want, and then it will iteratively snap towards the object of interest, taking into account all these constraints that you put into the energy functional about being smooth, being as much as possible along strong gradients in as much as they are there in the image, and otherwise just force the contour to go through the areas based on the expected shape. So this is very application dependent, of course. So active contours. So did I mention the word snake before? So that's usually how they are known in literature. How did you segment it? I used snakes. Okay, snakes is a very popular term in image segmentation literature. It means this kind of active contour, iterative approaches. They use an explicit representation of the boundaries, because you really literally need to define points and interpolate them, so you get some kind of mathematical description, explicit, of the contour. Typically requires manual interaction, as I mentioned before. But the big limitation of this kind of approaches is that they are limited to the topology, so the topology of the object shape, you could say, that you start with. So if during iterations you try to fit your model to your data, and then at some point the algorithm comes to the conclusion, oh, actually I started with the wrong shape, it has the wrong topology, it doesn't fit actually my object, it's very hard to make topological changes to the model. So then it requires reparametrization of the curve, for example. And so this is why these techniques are not that popular anymore, but people started to use what are called level set methods, which I would say are a bit more sophisticated way of doing active contours in the end, by using not explicit representations of the contours, but implicit. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what I mean by that. But just in words, you are representing the boundaries of the objects by the zero set of a higher dimensional function. Actually, maybe I should show it immediately. That makes it a bit more clear. So suppose you're interested in, suppose you have a shape, you want to segment a shape like this in an image, or something that, that may change shape from something like this into a completely separated tube. So this is what you will typically see in, when you do cell tracking, for example. If you have microscopy movies of cells, they move around, they change shape, but they may even change topology. They may completely separate, cell division. So this is a nice example of what may happen in such images. And the question is, how can you accommodate this? It's very hard to do with explicit shape models, such as used in active contour or snakes algorithms. But you can do this using level sets. So the idea is that if you want to segment a two-dimensional shape, you're going to define a three-dimensional function, such as it's red, right? On my screen it's red. I don't know what it looks like on this screen. It looks very dark, but the red surface is a three-dimensional surface, and this purplish cut plane through the surface, that represents the zero level of this function. That represents the contour of the object. And now I can change the shape, or can evolve the shape of this three-dimensional level set function to match the contour of the two-dimensional object that I want to segment. And it allows for topological changes as well. So that's the idea. The whole problem comes down to evolving some kind of energy functional that will change the shape of this surface to match the objects in the two-dimensional image. Let's see if there are a few more remarks here that I skipped just a minute ago. Yeah, so you evolve this level set function to make the zero set, so this cut plane, fit and track objects, and it allows topological changes. Of course, this is a much more computationally demanding solution than the simple explicit two-dimensional active contour methods, but it tends to be more robust and more flexible in terms of dealing with different types of shapes. So here are a few examples of applying level set segmentation, where you start with, what you see here, the contours are actually the two-dimensional contours, so the cuts through a three-dimensional surface, which apparently has many peaks in this case. And then you evolve that three-dimensional shape such that these rings start to merge or disappear altogether to match the two-dimensional object in this case. I think I have a link here with more information. There's also the most famous approach to level set segmentation is the Chen and Wies model. The paper is here if you want to read about it. It uses a particular energy functional that it minimizes. And it's very robust to noise, as you can see in these examples taken from the paper. Extremely noisy data, but you can still come up with some kind of sensible shapes. I think this is the evolution. So this is the vertical direction is the iteration time, so to speak. So how the shape evolves to match the shape of the plane in this case. Okay, so that was a lot of different techniques. I hope I haven't killed you. It's a lot, I realize, but I hope this gives a nice overview. And I've also put a lot of links in there, so if you want to know more, about these examples that I showed, you can look up the papers to dig a little deeper into some of the algorithms. But I think altogether this is a good representation of the state of the art at the moment, let's say in the more traditional image segmentation literature. And again, we're going to talk about even more sophisticated deep learning techniques in 3 weeks from now. Any questions at this point? Otherwise, I want to spend a few more minutes on how to evaluate segmentation methods. But first, if you have any questions about the basic techniques, let me know, either now or afterwards. No questions at this point? Okay, so then a few slides on the evaluation of segmentation methods, because this is an interesting website. I really recommend you to have a look at this one. It's focused on biomedical image analysis, so using computer vision methods to do segmentation in, well, primarily segmentation, but there are a few other problems as well, such as tracking. But this page, grand-challenge.org, collects all the international challenges that are organized, so international competitions, where people are challenged to test their methods on standardized data sets to see which methods work best for the particular problem. There are more than 100 different challenges here, all kinds of biomedical image analysis problems. But it's a nice source of inspiration for the kinds of problems that are out there, in this case in the biomedical world, but also for all the different techniques that people have developed and how they rank approximately. So which methods work best for which type of biomedical image analysis problems. And in many of these challenges, segmentation is one of the core problems. And so I think it's a very nice resource, very nice source of inspiration. But I want to talk a little bit about the metrics that they use in these challenges to determine how good, or to quantify the performance of a segmentation method. So I need to introduce a little bit of terminology that I want you to be familiar with. And actually I already used this terminology throughout this lecture. It shows you in a simple diagram here. Suppose we have a segmented object. So I used a method to segment an object that gives me a segmentation. For example, I tried to segment a cell or something, and this blue shape is what the segmentation method gave me, the set of pixels S from the segmentation. But you also know the truth. What should the real output of the segmentation method have been, ideally? That's the true object pixel set T. Now you may ask yourself the question, how do we know the truth? If I have any image, I can feed it to some segmentation algorithm and I will get a segmentation out. But so how do I know what is the truth? What should have come out of the segmentation method? Usually the human expert is the reference, is the standard. So what happens in a lot of these challenges is that in this case, since it's biomedical applications, the doctors are the people who will determine what the answer should be, what the output should be of a segmentation method. So to create this reference, they spend huge amounts of time to help us, computer scientists, develop better methods. They spend huge amounts of time to manually annotate data. For example, if you want to segment the brain in MR brain scans or something, they would produce data sets where they would take a data set and then manually outline exactly where the brain is, and telling us basically, okay, this is what your computer is supposed to give me, So there's a lot of manual work involved here, but usually the human expert is the reference here. And so we always try to come up with what we call the ground truth. So whenever we test segmentation methods, we know what the answer should be. And then, of course, you can have a whole discussion about how reliable is this, what the human being tells me, because if I ask another expert, I will probably get a slightly different answer. So there's a whole research behind this of how to best come up with a good reference data set. But anyway, suppose we have the truth, and suppose we have the output of a segmentation method, then what we can easily classify each pixel as a true positive pixel, so it was correctly segmented or correctly labeled as object. Or you can have a true negative that was correctly labeled as background, or you can have these mixtures where you have, for example, false positives. They are labeled as object, but they should have been labeled as background. So that's here, for example, false positives. And then you have false negatives. They are labeled as background, but should have been labeled as object. And with these 4 sets of pixels, so you can partition the whole image into 4 sets now. You have a pixel is either a true positive in the segmentation or it's a true negative, false positive, false negative. And you can use these to define, to come up with a metric of, how good is my segmentation. For example, sensitivity. Sensitivity and specificity are the most popular ones. Sensitivity is the true positive rate, so that tells you the number of true positives divided by true positives plus false negatives. So that is actually the fraction of the true object that is correctly segmented. And the specificity is the true negative rate. So that does the same, but then for the background. So it's true negatives divided by true negatives plus false positives. So that's the fraction of the true background that is correctly segmented. And these measures are used a lot to quantify the performance of segmentation methods. And there's one more thing that I want to show you, a technique that helps you to, in comparing different segmentation methods, let's say how robust they are. Because as I pointed out throughout this lecture, for all these different methods, all methods usually have one or more parameters. It could be the threshold is the simplest case, that is a threshold parameter. But also, for example, for k-means, you have the number of clusters. For this mean shifting, you need to define the window size. All algorithms, they come with one or more free parameters that you can play with as a user. And the question is, when you apply any segmentation method, how does the result actually depend on these free parameters? So when I start varying them, how much will that affect my end result? And this is a very important thing to look at when you evaluate segmentation methods. How does the segmentation behave as a function of changing the free parameter or parameters? But you're going to look at it one at a time in this case. So what I'm showing you here is just the simplest case for thresholding. If this is the image, and I set a threshold, I'm going to get an output image. And so this is the input, and this is what the algorithm, the segmentation algorithm, should give me. This is the truth, manually labeled. So when I apply now my threshold to this input image, I'm going to get a certain segmentation, and I can compare it to the truth using sensitivity and specificity, or actually 1 minus specificity. This is a kind of historical thing that people have always flipped the shape of this plot, but never mind. Let's call it sensitivity, or 1 minus. You need to just invert it. But this plot, sensitivity versus specificity, shows you the behavior of in this case, the thresholding, as a function of the threshold, as a function of the free parameter. Because think about what happens. If I would put my threshold all the way to 0, then what happens is that all pixels will be classified as object pixels, right? So my image, my segmentation will look like this. It's all white. Every pixel is now labeled as an object pixel. So if I compare this image to this image, then I have a very high sensitivity, so meaning the object pixels are all correctly classified as object, but I have a very low specificity. In fact, all my background pixels are wrongly classified. Okay, so I totally screwed up in the background, and I did a perfect job in the foreground. So that is this point in this plot. The other extreme is that I put my threshold all the way to the highest value or above, and then all the pixels will be classified as background and nothing as object, right? So that's the other extreme, that's right here. In this case, it's 256 because it's an 8-bit image. And so that means that my background is perfectly classified. So the specificity is 1, and 1 minus specificity is 0. But my sensitivity is 0. So these are the two extremes. And then when you vary the threshold in between these two extremes, then you will get different fractions of, sensitivity, specificity, meaning different points in this space, sensitivity, specificity space. And it will create a curve.